Um, there's a dearth of information by black officers, enlisted people, military people in general, about their experiences in the military. I'm personally trying to improve that by getting people to come forward and tell their stories. I want to read you something else from the African American Review. This was published in 1997. This is about the lack of writing by African American service members. Especially galling that white authored representations have ideologically entrapped images of the war, leading to a situation in which black and white soldiers are deracialized, and we as readers are no longer able to make distinctions between black and white. More accurately drawn representations by black officers, which are quite scarce, we have to instead come to depend on white narrators. The major question, it seems, is not how blacks have been represented by white authors, but rather how they have been represented by black ones, because what is remarkable is that so few works in general, and memoirs in particular, have been written about Vietnam by African American veterans. Of the almost 600 Vietnam novels listed in some bibliography, only 3 were written by Vietnam veterans. So you have 3 Vietnam veterans out of 600 with firsthand experience who are writing about those experiences. There is just a complete lack of representation, and it's even worse in the Navy. There are very few, I can't find but a couple that are written by members that served after the Vietnam War. You may know one, Jennifer Carroll, who was former lieutenant governor. She was Admiral Kevin Delaney's aide when I was running the telephone office. If I have time, I'll tell you an interesting story about Admiral Delaney. If you've never had an admiral yell at you because you wouldn't do something he was asking you to do, I promise you it's an exciting experience. So, there's something else I'd like to read to you also. The Navy's investigative complaint process was flawed in the 90s, and I believe it's flawed now. They had several problems. This report was sent to Congress. Problems were, 1, the investigators were not independent. Second was the investigative work was not complete. Case documentation was not complete, and investigations were not timely. Some of those problems exist in the one that was done by the Department of Defense IG. Once they got word of the transgressions, the man in charge, the head Navy officer, drags his feet for a while. He should have conducted the investigation rather than having it go to the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. Now you imagine that you're some young sailor as opposed to up-and-coming female naval officer on the one of the high staffs. Imagine what that person has to deal with. There was a book written that just came out this year called Darker Than Navy Blue by a young lady called Nicole Strong. She was repeatedly sexually assaulted, raped. She was forced out of the Navy on a personality disorder to cover up the shenanigans that were going on. It's a very terrible story to read. She's on the mend. Of course, she's got PTSD. She went through prostitution and you name it. And she came out on the other side. She's feeling much better about herself and actually about the Navy, because she had issues before she came in the Navy. But when the system doesn't protect you from the people that are supposed to be taking care of you, then where do you go? You don't have very many options. I just want to reiterate, I love the Navy. I am grateful for everything the Navy did for me, but I want the Navy to be better than what it was and better than what it currently is, because I see the Navy going backwards because they've forgotten a lot of the things that happened in the past. Let me know if I'm talking too long, because I will do that. Okay. I want to read a couple of other things to you, and then I'll open up to some questions. Just so you don't think this is something that happened in the past, in 2013, there was an admiral who was relieved because, among other things, he was making disparaging comments about minority officers, in particular flag officers. He said that the surface Navy was being weakened because it was being weakened by minority officers that were being promoted to flag rank. One of those officers he was talking about by name was Vice Admiral Michelle Howard, who at one point had been his boss. She was one of the most outstanding individuals in the Navy. She won an award as a junior officer, was the first black woman to command a ship. Basically every job she ever had, she was the first woman or the first black woman to do it. And this gentleman is talking about how in the aviation community, he happened to be a pilot, he said, we don't allow that to happen. We either don't let them in or we take care of it once they get in. That is one of the reasons that there are only 2% of flight officers in the Navy. 2% of the pilots in the Navy are black. I can't tell you that it's discrimination, but the washout rate is much higher for pilots, black pilots, than it is for, you know, the generic. So what he said was that essentially black pilots or black officers aren't good enough. Let me give you just a quick summation of my story, and then I'll open it up for any questions. I had lots of problems, and in some cases, I don't know how I survived some of the stuff I went through. Once I got my commission, I became a communications officer on a frigate. I worked for a great guy, Captain Jim Barton. He's read this book twice. He read it once 10 years ago, and then I put it away and tried to forget about it, and then read it again just before I published it. He was one of Zumwalt's young Turks. He was pushed up early to achieve command responsibility. And he told me years later, he said, Keith, the reason I thought you were my best officer is because you reminded me a lot of myself. And I made the mistake of, in my spare time, which no junior officer has, I qualified as a steam engineer on a ship where I was a communications officer. It had nothing to do with engineering, but I was greedy. I was trying to get promoted early. I had 10 years in the Navy, so I was trying to make up for lost time. So I qualified as a steam engineer, and rather than go to a follow-on division officer tour, I decided to go to department head school. I was one of 2 lieutenant junior grades there. Both of us were black. When I graduated from that school, I was the only officer that got an engineering department head tour that didn't have an engineering background. As far as I was concerned, they were throwing me to the wolves. I'd never served on a gas turbine ship. I'd never served in an engineering department. I went to a ship that had an all-white wardroom except me, and my department was mostly white except for a couple of junior petty officers. When I tell you I went through a buzzsaw, that's exactly what happened. I don't know how I survived that tour because I had subordinates, peers, and superiors that were not supporting me when I needed to be supported. There's some interesting stories in the book. Had I not been able to outsmart some of these people, I wouldn't be here now, talking to you as a retired naval officer. On my way to work one day, I decided I can't do this. So I was going to drive down to the beach. I was going to sit on the beach for a couple hours, and then I was going to go in and quit. When I got to the part where you turn to go to the beach or keep straight, the truck just went where it normally went. So I said, hell, the truck wants to go to work. I guess I'll go to work too. So I did 22 months in that tour because the guy that was following behind me did not pass the tactical action officer exam, and I had to do 4 months of his tour because he wasn't smart enough to pass it the first time. It's a 3-hour exam. You got to know every ship, every radar, every plane, every submarine. You got to know all that stuff, and then you got to know how to fight your own ship and defend against that. It is not a job of the faint-hearted. I did it in the Persian Gulf, and believe me, it's a stressful job. So when I left there, I became the executive officer on the Navy hydrofoil. That was a job that I wasn't qualified for because I was too junior. But because I was so far ahead of the pack and they didn't know what else to do with me, they decided to take a chance on me. Did a couple of years of that job, 18 months. Came to a squadron at Mayport. I was going to get a rest. I was going to be the safety officer. I'd done 3 ships in a row. I'm 2 years ahead of my peer group, and I'm the #1 guy wherever I am because I work harder. Not because I was smarter, but because I work harder. With the exception of the engineering tour, I was the #2 guy, and I was lucky to survive that period. So I walk in, and 2 months after the chief of staff, this crusty old captain, he's a good old Florida boy, born and raised here. He calls me into his office and says, Keith, I want you to take over the import training department. I said, sir, I'm not interested. I said, I'm not interested in taking on the busiest job on staff. I just enrolled in a master's degree program in human resources, and I want nothing to do with that job. He says, Keith, you're in the Navy. You know how this works. If you don't volunteer for it, you're going to wind up with it anyway. So I said, well, can I sleep on it? He says, yes. I went home, slept on it, didn't sleep well, came in the next morning and volunteered. I know how this works. It turns out that was the best job I ever had in the Navy. It's the best job I ever had. I'm going to read you what this guy said about me. And the former personnel officer can vouch for this. Okay, what he said was, at the end of that tour, the job that I did not want and wasn't really qualified for, he says, this is the #1 department head on a staff of superstars, possibly the best department head I have ever seen. Lieutenant Green has continued to be an innovative and forward-thinking member of my staff. His department has executed major changes to procedures and priorities which have had a significant impact on Mayport and Gulfport ships. I recommend this officer accelerated promotion to lieutenant commander and command at sea at the earliest opportunity. This was a crusty old Navy captain that was getting ready to retire. He stood me in front of Vice Admiral J. Paul Reason, who was the first black 4-star admiral in the Navy, and told the whole, it was a room just like this, and he said that he wished everyone did training the way that I did it. That was the proudest moment of my naval career. About 3 months later, I was fighting for my life because I checked into my next command. I was ordered in to be the officer in charge of the telephone office. I knew how to dial a telephone. That was easy. So, and it was shore duty, my first real shore duty. Before I could walk in and set down my briefcase, the executive officer came running down the hall and said, there's been a change in plans. You're going to take over the TQL coordinator. That's total quality leadership. It was a new CNO initiative. I'd done that stuff for years. I could do that with one hand tied behind my back. I'd been a leadership instructor for a couple of years. I knew this stuff backwards and forwards. All I needed was a lesson plan and I could teach it. And I said, well, I just talked to my sponsor a few minutes ago. What changed? Well, the XO said, well, if Cap wants you, thinks you'll be a better fit for this job. Would not make eye contact with me. So at the first opportunity, I went in to look at the captain's biography, which any smart junior officer would do. And I saw that he was born, raised, and educated in the great state of Alabama. Alabama has a peculiar history when it comes to race relations. And he graduated from Auburn in 1971. So I said, I think I might be in trouble here. So, and I was. After about a month, he finally decided to have his interview with me. Normally it happens the same day or the next day. So when I talked to him, he sat me down and he asked me a question, Keith, have you thought about going to department head school? He wasn't really interested in talking to me, so that's when I perked up, because I was doing mostly listening. And that's when I explained to him, Captain, this is my 4th department head tour. I gave him my background. And as I'm talking, his mouth drops open like I'm starting to sprout these horns. He made his decision to put me in this insignificant job simply based on how I looked. And about a week later, he announced in front of a room like this, where I was the only black person there, that he was going to use this superstar officer that had just been assigned to him to run the telephone office, which was the job I'd been ordered in there in the first place. But in addition to that, I was also going to run the facilities department, because I had this engineering background, and somebody must have told him I was a superstar, because that's the word he used. So I went from being a slug to a superstar just by him acquiring just a little bit of information. I had a problem with it because nobody discussed any of this with me on either end of that. So what I said to him was probably inappropriate, but it was how I felt. So I wound up with both jobs anyway. Shortly after that, 90 days after that, he transferred, and that's when my troubles really began. To make a long story short, I had to file a discrimination complaint against my commanding officer. The most documented complaint I've ever seen, and I've seen a lot of them. I'll let you figure out for yourself how that ends. It was not pretty, and I left the Navy with quite a bit of disillusionment and a lot of trauma. I didn't realize how much until years later, until I started writing about this and reading about it, etc. I don't want that to happen to anybody else, which is why I wrote the book. Unfortunately, I got a phone call a couple nights ago from an officer that was retired, and at some conference they had with the black naval officers that people are afraid of your book. They're worried about repercussions. How can you possibly be afraid of reading about what someone went through that was designed to keep you from having to go through the same things? I really didn't write the book for black officers. I wrote the book for white officers who don't understand what the black officers and the women go through, or any minority officer. You could be, a Guamanian female and have, if you're not a white male, gung-ho, go Navy guy, you're on the team, but you're often considered separate. So it concerns me that the Navy is afraid of the book. I've reached out to lots of people. Nobody wants anything to do with it. I use Navy statistics, DOD statistics, RAND Corporation, the Brookings Institution, you name it. It's packed with information that is valuable, and my goal is to try to get the Navy to embrace it rather than be afraid of it. So I've talked longer than I should have, and luckily I haven't told too many bad jokes. But I'll open it up now for anyone.